elections. And tonight, we're taking your questions to the two leading candidates in the biggest race on the ballot here in Indiana, as we sit down one-on-one with Republican Senator Todd Young and Democratic challenger Hammond Mayor Tom McDermott. And it all starts now on a special edition of In Focus, Senate Race 2022.
Good evening, I'm Dan Spieler. Thanks so much for joining us for this special edition of In Focus, Senate Race 2022, as we broadcast statewide tonight to take your questions directly to the candidates for U.S. Senate, with some recent polls showing a tighter than expected race here in Indiana. The two major party candidates are incumbent Republican Senator Todd Young and his Democratic challenger, Hammond Mayor Thomas McDermott Jr. At stake, the balance of power in the U.S. Senate, with the chamber split down the middle 50-50 right now. Both parties hoping to tip the scales in their favor. And tonight we hear from both Young and McDermott as they answer your questions on some of the key issues facing voters this fall. Speaking of those issues, let's start with State House reporter Kristen Eskow. She's breaking down some of the main topics the candidates are facing in this race for U.S. Senate.
You've probably been seeing the ads more often on TV lately.
A Marine Corps captain trained in counterintelligence.
Republican Senator Todd Young is seeking a second term in the Senate. He was first elected in 2016 and previously served 6 years in the House. He's focused his campaign on his military service, semiconductor manufacturing, and inflation.
The plan is quite simple. We need to stop spending trillions of dollars we don't have on things we don't need.
Young's Democratic opponent, Tom McDermott, is a Navy veteran who has been the mayor of Hammond in Northwest Indiana since 2004.
They want elected officials to solve problems, not take away freedoms.
McDermott says protecting abortion access is his top priority. He's vowed to vote in favor of codifying Roe v. Wade if elected.
Roe versus Wade worked for my entire life. For 5 decades, it was the precedent established by the U.S. Supreme Court that women had the right to privacy, including the right to have an abortion.
Laura Wilson, a political science professor with the University of Indianapolis, says inflation and abortion are the big issues this year.
Right now, there are a lot of major federal issues that are impacting Hoosiers. So I think they're looking at this race very carefully.
National analysts like the Cook Political Report consider the seat solid Republican and not competitive. But a poll released earlier this month by Indy Politics and ARW Strategies suggests otherwise, with McDermott trailing Young by 2 points. Meanwhile, Young has out-fundraised McDermott significantly. Data released by the Federal Election Commission shows as of late September, Young's campaign has $5.5 million cash on hand, compared to McDermott's nearly $400,000. In Indianapolis, I'm Kristen Eskow.
Kristen, thank you. Now, we should acknowledge there are technically 9 candidates running for Senate this year when you include the write-in candidates. However, only Senator Young and Mayor McDermott fulfilled our qualifying criteria for this forum. Senator Young sat down with us yesterday before flying back to Washington, and in just a few minutes, we'll hear live from his opponent, Mayor Tom McDermott, who's now in our other studio waiting for his turn on the program. But first, my conversation with the incumbent in this race. Right, here with Senator Todd Young. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah. Obviously, abortion is one of the big topics in the news this year, and it's one of the issues that our viewers are asking about. So let's get to that first viewer-submitted question, which comes to us from Kayla in Indianapolis. She asked, where do you stand on a federal abortion ban? Of course, that's been in the news a lot here lately since new federal restrictions were first proposed by your colleague, Senator Graham. So to Kayla's question, are these federal restrictions something you'd support, or do you think that issue should be left to the states?
Thank you, Dan. I know this issue elicits a lot of emotion and principled disagreement, to put it mildly, from my constituents. And the problem for years, I think, as it relates to law in this area, has been that it failed to invite a conversation with the American people and with the legislature. I'm actually paraphrasing the words used by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who herself was very pro-choice in her politics. That has been corrected through the Dobbs decision, return the decision on these matters to the states. And I think this creates an opportunity for Hoosiers to register their opinions through their state elected officials on an ongoing basis. I know our elected officials here at the state level have done their best to get it right, but what that means at the federal level is we need to give the states an opportunity to sort of work their will. So I don't favor legislative efforts, certainly in the near term, as it relates to this issue. And we couldn't get at the federal level, and we couldn't get 60 votes to implement any otherwise, realistically.
Do you think this proposal from Senator Graham is politically problematic at all in a midterm year with more voters perhaps motivated to turn out on this issue this year?
It's not problematic for me. I mean, Hoosiers have responded very well to my candid remarks, which is we're empowering them. I trust them to collectively make the right decisions, and we need to allow the process to continue to move forward.
If there were a federal law enacted, what types of exceptions might you want to see in that bill? You haven't been very specific on what exceptions you might personally support or not support. Would you insist on exceptions
I've
for
actually been
rape, incest, life of the mother?
Yeah. I've been very specific that exceptions here at the state level are things I'm comfortable accepting. Because I think that the people of Indiana deserve an opportunity to come up with their own law in this area. It's a hypothetical proposition, which you're asking at the federal level, but I'll take a look at whatever legislation might come before us in this area and consult with Hoosiers in the process.
You've said you'd accept those exceptions.
Yeah.
Your opponent did point out in a recent ad, though, that you reportedly did call for a total ban with no exceptions in a Right to Life survey in 2016. Was that indeed your position then, and to what extent has your position changed since then?
Yeah, that's one of those surveys where you're not given a whole lot of opportunity to explain at greater length, so I do appreciate this opportunity. I actually, in the notes field of that survey, explained, philosophically where I'm coming from. I agree, as so many others do, that life begins at conception. This is not an outside of the mainstream view. This is something that, say, the Catholic Church has embraced for hundreds and thousands of years. Because of that, I have a pro-life position, and I think that's broadly recognized, but because we have a small d democracy, a democratic process, I can accept exceptions. But I also think it's important, we need to pivot in terms of our culture of life. Now that the decisions are being made by the respective 50 states, at the federal level, my point of emphasis is going to be on supporting mothers, expectant, and those who have had children, in supporting children in whatever way we can. And that's going to be my point of emphasis.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to this question from Elizabeth from Cloverdale, who asked, if there were a national abortion ban, what would you do to protect the women and people of Indiana?
Oh, goodness, we need to do a whole lot of things. And one of my self-critiques of some who embrace a pro-life culture is we're not doing enough to support women and babies and young children as they grow into adulthood. So among the things we need to do is we need to reduce the regulatory burden to adoptions. We need to take a look at the supports that we give to young children and mothers in low-income circumstances and up our game there. So I want to challenge those who hold an identifiably pro-life position to think about other ways we can support women and children.
Okay, let's change gears here. We've got a lot of topics to get to, and up next we have a question coming from our anchor Dirk Rowley at our station in Fort Wayne. Dirk?
The most recent numbers from Statista.com say 76% of Americans disapprove of how Congress is doing its job. The question, how would you fix Washington?
So how do you fix Washington? And building on that, viewers have asked, how do you plan to bridge the divide that seems to be growing between the two major parties in Congress?
I'm grateful for the question, and for those who watch these things closely, I think many of them here in the state of Indiana and beyond would say, Senator Young, Todd Young, actually has been sort of modeling positive behavior. And I think if more people did what I did, which is demonstrate principled disagreements, make arguments when you disagree, but stay out of the habit of castigating your opponents and personalizing your attacks, That would move us forward quite a bit, and also looking for opportunities to cooperate across the aisle when people have good ideas that would benefit your constituents. So I'll continue to do that if the people of Indiana will send me back to represent them for another 6 years.
So inflation's a big topic in the news this year, obviously. I want to toss back now to something that you said in last Sunday's debate about spending and various bills that have come before Congress here in recent years.
As Hoosiers watch from their living rooms this evening, we know that they are hurting. They are hurting as a result of the multi-trillion-dollar tax and spend policies of the Biden administration. The first thing they did when they came into office is rush through a stimulus bill. This is the last thing you want to do, a stimulus bill, which led to all manner of inflation. So we need to stop spending trillions of dollars that will just exacerbate this problem.
Senator Young wants us to believe in Indiana that Joe Biden walked into the White House and inflation was all his fault. Senator Young's been in Washington, D.C. for 12 years and raised the nation's debt $16 trillion since he's been in office. He's the most liberal Republican I've ever met.
The uptick in spending that's been referred to multiple times now was a result of a global pandemic. It's the job of government to help people out during a global pandemic. What would have they cut? Household payments, paycheck protection program to ensure employers remain whole and will be there on the back end of the pandemic. Operation Warp Speed.
Thank you.
All right, so you mentioned a number of items there that Congress approved during the Trump administration, but you were critical of some of the additional pandemic-related, to some extent, spending measures passed during the Biden administration. How do you respond to those who might wonder if your support of those bills comes down to which party is in power? We got a question along those lines from Tom in Greenwood here, who asked, why do you support tax cuts? Why did you support tax cuts in 2017, which targeted larger corporations and wealthy individuals, while voting against the recent Inflation Reduction Act?
So I'll hit that one directly, but essentially what you have here is the failure to show wisdom and discernment by so many national Democrats as it relates to spending. We spent during the pandemic, as I indicated during the debate. We've actually cut federal spending consistently, the annual spending that Congress actually votes for since I came into elective office. That was interrupted, as I indicated, by the global pandemic. There's some larger programs that we'll have to work together to make solvent. With respect to the tax program, I hear from so many, especially small businesses, but our larger businesses here in Indiana as well, that if it weren't for elimination of the medical device tax, if it weren't for improvement in the marginal rates of our small businesses, they wouldn't have survived the global pandemic. We implemented these in order to make them more competitive against other competitors around the globe. It turned out they really helped, the lower rates helped them make it through the pandemic.
Now, in the debate, your opponent also referenced the CHIPS Act that you helped get passed through the Senate. He described it as another costly spending bill in his words. What's your response to his comments on that?
Well, number one, it's a national security investment. We need these computer chips, and we need them made here so that we know what's in them as opposed to China or other places, so that they can go into our fighter aircraft, our radar systems, and so forth. Hoosiers understand that. The second thing is I can not only defend this, but say this is absolutely necessary in a modern economy to keep inflation down. We need to make our own computer chips so that the GM plant in Fort Wayne, which is idled twice this year as a result of having a sufficient number of computer chips, can assemble all the automobiles that come before this. So our farmers can fix their planters when there's a global pandemic or, God forbid, a geopolitical event that prevents chips from being imported into this country.
Another question here about inflation and gas prices from my colleague Birchelle Edmay at Fox 59 in Indianapolis.
Inflation at this point has hit every corner of Hoosiers' lives, whether that's at the grocery store or the gas pump. And just recently, the president has talked about releasing from the strategic reserve. What is your reaction to the president's action, and what would you do to address inflation in the Hoosier state?
All right, so two parts to that question. First, what's your reaction to the president releasing more fuel from the nation's strategic reserves?
The strategic reserves are supposed to be just that. They're strategic. It's for national security purposes. This is not a national security purpose. In fact, frankly, it's not necessary. Instead, what we should be doing is increasing oil and gas production in this country. The president has exhausted all of other opportunities aside from the obvious solution, as Hoosiers know this, which is to increase production domestically as we were doing under Republican leadership.
And what other actions would you take at the federal level to try and slow down inflation generally?
Well, reducing regulations, including those on oil and gas, but you see them in the housing sector, you see them across our economy. So taking the cost out of things through regulatory reduction. And then let's stop spending the trillions we don't have on things we don't need. Household payments. The pandemic is over. Hoosiers are workers. They don't need household payments. They tell me this. This only exacerbates inflation. No, by the way, it may help them. You may get a little sugar high in your household budget, but as Hoosiers will tell you, it's certainly not enough to keep up with the inflation, the cost of goods that they buy.
My kids are often on a sugar high. I'm sure yours are too.
Mine
That's
are
another
too.
topic
Yeah.
entirely.
Halloween's coming up.
That's right, right. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine has also impacted gas prices around the world. And on Ukraine, we have a question here from Bob Wallace in Carmel, who asks, can you explain why you vote for tax dollars to be sent to Ukraine and how that benefits Hoosiers?
Thank you so much for the question, Bob. This is really an essential investment in our own national security. Of course, it's an investment in the success and the security of the Ukrainian people. But more importantly, if we arrest the expansion of Russia into Ukraine, if we affirm the globally recognized principle of self-government and territorial sovereignty, that will prevent the Chinese Communist Party, which is watching this conflict intently, from grabbing Taiwan. If they were to grab Taiwan, those computer chips we've talked about, and it's going to take a couple of years for us to get a measure of independence in supplying those and running a modern economy. But if they were to grab Taiwan, our economic life as we know it would fundamentally change. So that's what's most accessibly in it for Hoosiers. There are a number of value propositions. There's other bad actors like Iran and North Korea watch this as well.
Just this past week, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said if Republicans take back the House, America will no longer be, quote, writing blank checks for the war in Ukraine. Do you take issue with that sentiment?
I'm not in favor of blank checks. That's why the last tranche of funding for Ukraine, I and other Republicans insisted that we had some guardrails in there to ensure those monies were actually being spent in a way that was consistent with the U.S. interests. And we're spending dollars, frankly, like they're our own as opposed to government dollars.
Do you think some interpreted his comments that Republicans may no longer fund to the extent the United States has so far the efforts Ukraine has taken?
I don't believe that's what he meant. If that is what he meant, I'll take issue with that.
Okay. How's Congress accounting for the funding already being sent to Ukraine?
So that's part of our oversight responsibility, where we hold hearings and we're able to call people before our committee of jurisdiction in the light of day so the American people can hear it. So that's the most important thing we can do. But there are limitations right now, and I want to emphasize this. Right now we have the Biden administration, which has not instilled a whole lot of trust about how they're spending money. If Republicans can be put in charge of these committees of jurisdiction in the House and also State Senate, we can be a little more probing. We can kick the tires and ensure that we're getting all the investment that we want to from every dollar spent.
But you'd want to make sure that funding is still there for Ukraine as they continue to hold off the Russians.
Absolutely. The last thing we want to do right now is let Vladimir Putin out of the trap he finds himself in.
Let's talk about border security here at home. Republicans have had a lot to say about the situation along our southern border with Mexico. But if Republicans do regain control of Congress, what specific actions will your party take when it comes to this issue?
Well, there again, we will ensure that we are relentless in our committee hearings. But beyond just the talk and the cross-examination and the request for documents, as important as those are, I favor, and I think what you'll see is us actually voting on legislation to fund fencing, walls where they're appropriate so that our Border Patrol agents can be more effective in other areas along the southern border. I think you'll see more resourcing going to our Border Patrol agents, more use of technology and so forth, and then an effort to legislatively reinstate Title 42 or other sort of measures. That would be a public health measure that have staunched the flow historically of what we now see is 2 million illegals that have crossed since President Biden came into office.
Another viewer question here on a separate topic from DJ in Indianapolis. He asks, will you take immediate action to legalize marijuana? Now, your opponent's been very vocal about this issue. Where do you stand on legalizing marijuana at the federal level?
Yeah, this is not, and I just want to be candid, this is not my top priority. It's not a first order priority, but the question was asked, and so I know it is important to some constituents. I have an opponent who's running, this is arguably his most important issue. I think we have inflation, we have border security, you have supply chain challenges, national security challenges. Hoosiers don't want me to focus on this. That said, I think I favor investing in more research to ensure that whatever we might do at the federal level is consistent with public health and the safety, particularly of our young people, and I want to make sure it's right for Indiana. Beyond that, it's mostly a state-level decision, and I can facilitate more state-level decisions by, for example, if you have businesses who are supplying those who consistent with state law, are able to go out and buy marijuana-related products, we need to allow those legitimate businesses to be able to bank in local financial institutions. So that would be an area where I've led.
Another question here from Carolyn Hers in Indianapolis. She asks, what do you see as the major problems with our healthcare system? What should Congress do to fix them? Oh,
goodness, there are a lot of problems. I acknowledge this, and I think our points of emphasis should be insurers need to have more competition. As do our providers. We need to actually compensate our providers for the success they have in making their patients more healthy, something that increasingly can be measured. And then we need to give consumers more choice. Some areas where I've led in this very large topic of healthcare are telehealth. I am the leader in the United States Senate on the Republican side, trying to ensure that more people can access their health care online. Especially in rural communities where we don't have enough providers. The other area is ensuring that it's safe to go to the mailbox again. There are no surprise medical bills when it comes to our healthcare system, and we've come up with some legislation that we really think can improve that.
Another question here and a new topic from a viewer, Matthew Abner in Evansville. He asks, would you support term limits on all federally elected and federally appointed positions throughout the U.S. government?
I do support term limits. Term limits ever since I first ran for federal office. This is something our founding fathers considered. They actually called it rotation in office. Many of them hailed from states at the time of framing our Constitution that had term limits. It seems to have worked, and we have a lot of talented people, a lot of Hoosiers who could do very well in these federal positions. That argument was lost and is consistently lost. I think in order for this thing to work, though, you're going to need a constitutional amendment, which I would favor, to enact term limits to apply to everyone. Otherwise, you're going to have careerists who've been in office for 50 years really having even more power over the system if you have public-spirited people going and returning to live under the laws they've helped create.
Question here from Nathan Moody in Indianapolis. He asks, do you think that if someone takes the oath as a public servant, should they sell all of their public holdings and or stocks before taking office? This has been a big issue lately, talking about stock trading among members of Congress. Are you concerned at all that of some of the things that have been in the news on this issue?
I'm very concerned. I think the best thing we can do is to better police trading.
How do you do
based
that?
on information? Well, probably more specific disclosure about what assets you owe, at what time, and in what. This is something, for better or for worse, this U.S. Senator doesn't have to worry much about. It's all publicly available information. I'm pretty modest means. But with that said, I think a prohibition on owning stock would prevent a lot of good people from running for office in the first place. And we want people with some professional success to run for these positions. But I do favor more scrutiny.
I want to move to a question now from Cindy in Fishers, who wants to know, do you think that former President Trump should be held accountable for his handling of classified documents?
Oh, goodness. It is a former Marine Corps intelligence officer with a top secret and even security clearance. I take these matters really seriously, and I'd be emphatic in saying everyone should be held accountable for any violations of holding classified documents, whether that's President Biden or people in his orbit or the former Republican president. We don't have different standards. We shouldn't have different standards for a political class in this country.
Deanna in Madison wanted to know about the January 6th investigation and said, in light of the findings of the committee, do you wish you'd taken a stronger stand regarding Trump's attempt to overthrow the election results, in her words?
Oh, goodness. I took the strongest possible stand with respect to certification of the election, recognizing on the day that those ballots were submitted, just weeks after the election, that President Biden was the President of the United States. And
you did vote to acquit in the impeachment, the second impeachment.
So this comes down to the matter of due process, right? There were no witnesses allowed by Chuck Schumer. Why? Because Chuck Schumer said they had important business to tend to. What was that important business, Dan? It was the stimulus package, $1.8 trillion, which has led, I'll tell Hoosiers, to the inflation we're experiencing right now. That's why we didn't call witnesses. And so you now have a committee, which typically precedes an impeachment, to look into all of these matters. And I just didn't think that was good due process. History proves me right.
Should President Trump comply with the subpoena that the committee just issued?
Listen, the lawyers are working that out right now. It is a bit of a historical new ground, as I understand, for a former president to be called by a committee of jurisdiction in this sort of capacity. So, well, I'll let the lawyers work it out, figure out what the law is, maybe with the help of the courts, and then we should follow the law.
And will you support President Trump if he's the nominee in 2024?
Oh, I'm looking at this election right now. We're going to have a deep bench, though, as it relates to the Republican Party and coming elections.
Given everything that we have seen the last couple of years, how do you feel overall about the current state of the Republican Party right now in 2022, in a year where the party is also running Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz for Senate? Is populism the future of the party, or is there a more ideal approach for Republicans to take politically, in your view?
I think the Democrats have demonstrated to us that the populism that they have put forward isn't selling. If populism means just being connected to the needs and aspirations and challenges of people who've been overlooked and forgotten economically in particular in recent years, then I'm all for it. If instead it's something else intended to divide Americans, I'm against it. I think we have a real opportunity as members of the National Democratic Party are dividing people by race and gender and other categories to move in and be the party that represents all Americans.
Do you see divisive rhetoric within your own party that
I see it on both parties.
That you don't want to
in
see
fairness, I see it from both parties. I see it from
arena.
All kinds of circles these days. And so we all have a responsibility to try and bring people together during times like this.
We have another question from one of our partner stations, anchor Dana Winklebeck at our station in Terre Haute.
Indiana's business culture has grown significantly in recent years. What ideas have you seen here at home that you can take back to Washington?
What ideas would you like to see Washington take when it comes to helping the business climate?
Well, I think when it comes to our state government, we've consistently put forward great ideas. I love how we invested in infrastructure a number of years back here in the state of Indiana, figuring out how to repurpose a public asset, pull some money out of that, and fund a 10-year road plan. So that's certainly something worthy of replication. I'll visit places like the Signature School in Evansville and see what community leaders have done building a magnet school, a charter school that serves people of all socioeconomic groups. They are among the top performing schools in the state of Indiana consistently, just because of high teacher quality and a really supportive and loving atmosphere. So those are some of the areas that we really can emphasize, but it all comes down to working well together. Hoosiers, some lament the fact that we don't have oceans and we don't have beaches, but our oceans and beaches are the people themselves, and we figured out how government and business and labor and not-for-profits can all work very well together and come up with creative solutions to pressing challenges. We need more of that in Washington, D.C., and that's the spirit I want to bring to this office.
Finally, what else do you want voters to know before they go to the polls next month?
Well, I think it's really important during a time like this: high inflation, weak border security, a war overseas, and crime in many of our communities, that people know that I understand they are hurting. I live here in the state of Indiana. I'm very connected to the needs and concerns of rank-and-file Hoosiers, and I consistently put forward solutions. Whoever is willing to partner with me on them, we'll find a path to success. I've done that on the CHIPS and Science Act, which is creating great high-tech jobs. At the same time, it's allowing us to fight off the Chinese Communist Party. I will continue to work on such big things on Hoosiers' behalf and staying connected with them if I earn their trust and support for another 6 years.
Senator Todd Young, thank you so much for answering our questions and the questions from our viewers today as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
We'll be right back after this with Mayor Tom McDermott. Clip that plays from the debate you guys did last weekend, and there will be a couple of clips that come from other reporters, and you'll hear them.
Sure.
If there's any issue with
Sure.
it, I can
Look at you,
state
right?
it, or, yeah, you just look at me.
Mm-hmm.
Keep buttoned.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, welcome back. We just heard from Republican Senator Todd Young, and now we're here live with his opponent, Hammond Mayor Tom McDermott, the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Dan.
Let's start on inflation here. It's at a 40-year high. It's been politically problematic for the Biden administration. It could potentially lead to a change of power in one or both chambers of Congress. But for a lot of people, it's really not about the politics, right? It's about how much their groceries cost. It's about how much they're paying for gasoline. If you're elected to the Senate, how will you and others in Washington work to fix this problem?
Well, you know, one of the worst problems with inflation, one of the biggest drivers of inflation is government spending. And what Senator Young wants us to believe is he's been in Washington, D.C. for 12 years, and all the inflation problems that we're experiencing in the United States are the fault of one person, that's Joe Biden. And I find that hard to believe personally. I mean, adding $16 trillion to the nation's debt, which has occurred under Senator Todd Young, is inflationary. And that's the thing that makes me crazy about Senator Young, is he's got two faces. He's an inflation fighter, but he's also adding to the problem. Even the recently passed CHIPS Act is a spending bill. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have supported it, I would have.
The bipartisan bill had a lot of Democratic support.
It was, and it's also inflationary. It's a spending bill. It's going to help drive up the inflation rate. And so when Todd Young's talking about inflation, he's talking with two sides of his mouth. He wants to be an inflation fighter, but at the same time, he's helping add to the problem.
You made that point at the debate as well, but right now it is the Biden administration and the Democratic Party that's in control of Congress. Both Senator Young and President Biden recently said, Senator Young in our interview and President Biden in a recent interview with 60 Minutes, that the pandemic is quote unquote over. And Senator Young pointed to that as a reason why he hasn't supported some of the perhaps pandemic related spending bills that have come before Congress in recent years. What's your reaction to that? Do you think the pandemic is over? Do you think Congress will have to spend more money to help people deal with the impact of this pandemic moving forward?
I think the pandemic's over, However, COVID's still out there and it's lingering. People are still getting sick today, but I don't think that we're in the crisis we were in March of 2020 when this first came out. And I don't blame anybody in office for taking the precautions and the actions that they did. I understand that was
including the spending bills.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's inflationary, let's be honest. And Todd Young supported it. And that's the thing. So here we are, and Todd Young wants all Hoosiers to believe that Joe Biden's the one at fault for all the inflation problems in America when he's supported all these spending bills since he's been in office.
What's your reaction to the president releasing more fuel this past week from the nation's strategic oil reserves? Is that a move you think will help? Is that a move you support?
It's a Band-Aid, let's be honest. But right now Americans are hurting and OPEC is holding us hostage, so to speak. And I think it was a necessary move. And I'm glad the president did that to help lower the cost of fuel.
Any environmental concerns? Is it a move you think they'd have to make again down the road? What do you want to see long term when it comes to that
Well, right
policy?
now, let's face it. I mean, right now, most of us are using fossil fuels, which is unfortunate. And I think that in the future, more and more of us are going to be driving electric vehicles. But right now, this is what we use.
One of the other big topics, of course, in addition to inflation this year is the issue of abortion. A number of questions that came from our viewers on that topic that we asked Senator Young about as well, including a question from Kayla who asked, where do you stand on a federal abortion ban? Senator Young saying that currently he does not support a nationwide federal ban. Conversely, do you think there should be any limits on abortion, and do you support the president's efforts to try and codify Roe v. Wade into law?
I want to point out that Roe versus Wade did have limitations that worked for 50 years before it was upended with the U.S. Supreme Court. So I do support President Biden's attempt to try to codify Roe versus Wade. If I'm elected to represent the state of Indiana in the U.S. Senate, that's going to be one of my highest priorities, is to help bring back the protections that Hoosier women had to be able to perform this procedure without interference from politicians.
How motivating an issue do you think that will be for voters this fall? A lot of recent polls have shown that inflation is still the top issue for a lot of voters this year.
I hope that's not the case. I hope that when you lose a right permanently, that would be more important than inflation, which is a temporary problem. But it is temporary. It's not a permanent inflation problem we're having, whereas Hoosier women are never going to have the rights that they had just a couple months ago because of the passage of SB 1.
President Biden said this week that it would be the first bill that he would have Congress take up if Democrats pick up seats in the midterms to codify Roe v. Wade. But it's a bit more complicated than that, of course, because of the filibuster. And building on that, here's a question now from our State House reporter, Kristen Eskow.
Traditionally, bills require 60 votes to pass the Senate, but it's unlikely any legislation codifying Roe v. Wade would gain Republican support. Assuming Democrats hold less than 60 seats in the Senate next year, would you support bypassing the filibuster so the Senate could pass abortion legislation on a simple majority vote?
So you've expressed some support for getting rid of the filibuster. Is that a move you'd still support at this point?
I'd like to point out that I hear a lot from the other party about how they follow the Constitution, and I want to point out that the Constitution doesn't mention filibusters at all. This was a rule that we made up, and quite frankly, I think it's ruining the Senate. And I do support getting rid of the filibuster as soon as I become a U.S. Senator.
This is a question we asked Senator Young as well from our affiliate in Fort Wayne. Recent polling shows a very low approval rating for Congress right now. If elected, what ideas would you have to try and fix Washington?
It's a lack of accountability. You know, Senator Young, when he raised his right hand and became Indiana's U.S. Senator, he said goodbye to Hoosiers. And as a mayor, that's against everything that I stand for as a mayor. I hold public meetings in every one of my districts every single year as mayor, and they're open to the public. They're aired on TV, and that's something I intend to do as Indiana's next U.S. Senator, is have Senators Night Out in every district across the state of Indiana, and it's called accountability, and that helps restore people's faith in government. I mean, most of these senators, when they go off to the U.S. Senate, they don't come back home, and they're certainly not accountable to Hoosiers.
More questions here from our viewers we want to get to. This comes from Deanna Shelley. She asks, what do you suggest to handle the intense divide in our country these days, and how do you persuade those who are in Washington, D.C. to work together?
Be a leader by example. I mean, one of my mentors and one of my favorite senators of all time is Joe Donnelly. And he was literally the most bipartisan senator in the United States Senate, and he paid. He was elected one term and then he lost. But quite frankly, you have to be willing to be a one-term senator. If you're doing what you think is right, I'm willing to lose if I think I'm doing the right thing. And I want to lead by example. And I want to be an American first, I want to be a Hoosier second, and a Democrat third. And I mean that with all my heart. And I'm a proud Democrat. But I'm an American first, and I'm a Hoosier second. And then party comes third. And I think right now, too many people prioritize party over being an American or being a Hoosier.
Todd Young pointed to that CHIPS Act you mentioned, suggesting that he also has been bipartisan on some measures in the Senate. What's your response to that?
I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think that's a campaign talking point that Todd Young wants to get across. But if you look at his record, I don't agree that he's been bipartisan.
You mentioned the Democratic Party. We had a question here from Bob Wallace in Carmel who asks, how will you assure Hoosiers that you won't fall in line with anything the Democratic leadership says to do, or how to vote on any issue that comes up in Congress?
That's a great question. And I think we've all grown skeptical of elected officials that when they're campaigning, they'll tell you one thing and then they go off to D.C. and they do another thing. And my entire career has been about being accountable and telling it like it is. My campaign slogan is all Hoosier, no BS. And quite frankly, I'm the kind of person that's going to tell you straight what's going on and be a man of my word. And that's what I intend to do as our senator.
And a follow-up here from Bob. Will you promise not to accept PAC money from leadership? Have you accepted any thus far in this race?
I have not accepted any thus far, but I'll be honest with you. One of the things, I mean, the gentleman I'm running against has $6 million of special interest money and corporate PAC money. And it's hard to measure up against, you know, I'm running a campaign and the national media, all they want to talk about is who raises how much money. I've raised $1.3 to $1.5 million by the time I end up running this campaign, and I'm being mocked for how small of a campaign war chest I have. And so it's hard to compete with senators like Todd Young that sold out a long time ago, and they have millions of dollars. And if I hold myself to a different set of rules, then I'm just going to be beat.
But he has outraised you significantly in this campaign. How do you keep up with that in terms of the process of campaigning, getting your message out, getting in front of voters when it comes to advertising, when it comes to the other apparatus of campaigns that, let's be honest, cost money? How do you keep up when Senator Young is outpacing you significantly when it comes to fundraising?
Keep in mind that while Senator Young's paying for all these commercials, he's off in Washington, D.C., and I'm driving across the state of Indiana shaking the hands of Hoosiers. In fact, since I started campaigning, I raised $1.5 million, as I indicated, drove 70,000 miles across the state, shook thousands of hands, caught COVID once. I mean, I've been all over this state, and that's how you have to work harder. I'm working harder than Senator Young. There's no doubt about it. He's off in D.C. I'm, driving to New Albany. I'm driving to Evansville. I'm driving to Fort Wayne. I'm driving to Indianapolis, talking to Hoosiers.
We're talking about the current state of politics, current state of the Democratic Party. How would you evaluate your party right now and how it's perceived nationally and here in the state of Indiana, traditionally a red state? Republicans have accused Democrats of moving too far to the left, just as Democrats have accused the GOP of moving too far to the right. What direction do you want to see your party take here in the coming years?
I want my party to care about states like Indiana. I think my party wrote off Indiana, and quite frankly, in my race against Todd Young, I think I'm a great challenger. I'm a 5-term mayor. I'm working hard. I've got a good message, and I've been ignored by the Democratic leadership. They lost confidence that Democrats could win in Indiana, and I know that's not the case.
In this cycle, you feel ignored by Democratic leadership currently?
Absolutely. In this cycle, I feel ignored by Democrats. They could care less about my race. They could care less. Contribution-wise, there's been no contributions. Heck, I didn't even get a phone call to say, congratulations, you won the primary. I mean, quite frankly, I think that the leadership in Washington, D.C. looks at the Democratic Party and they care only about the deep blue states, and they forgot about places like Indiana. And I want to win in Indiana to show the Democratic leadership nationwide that we got Democrats that could win in these states. You just got to pay attention to them, and they're not right now. And I'm critical of my party also. I think that my race is a perfect example. We're within 2 points of Todd Young, and I can't get a phone call from the Democratic Central Committee.
Where do you think your party needs to change specifically on the issues? A lot of issues that Republicans have hit modern Democrats for, that they feel that they've gone too far to the left. Where do you think your party
I got a
needs to
perfect
change?
example from 2 years ago, and I'd like to think that we've changed since then, was the defund the police movement. It was catastrophic to the Democratic Party. It's not how I ever felt. In fact, I've done nothing but support the police since I've been in office. But 2 years ago, the movement in our party was all about defunding the police, and we took a shellacking in 2020 because of that tagline that we took. And it's a perfect example of how we go too far to the left, because the average Hoosier doesn't want to defund the police. The average Hoosier is worried about crime, and if we appear like we're not supportive of the police department, then nobody's going to vote for our party. And I never felt that way, and I don't feel that way, and I won't feel that way again, but that's a perfect example of my party going too far to the left.
Midterm elections, people are always looking 2 years ahead, of course, to 2024 as well. And along those lines, here's another question from our colleague, Debbie Knox at CBS 4 Indy.
Mayor McDermott, I'm Debbie Knox from CBS 4. I'd like to know, if President Biden decides to run for a second term, will you support his candidacy?
Will you support Joe Biden in 2024 if he's the Democratic nominee?
If he's the Democratic nominee, I'll support him in 2024.
Do you think he should be the Democratic nominee in 2024?
Trying to get me in trouble, aren't you?
It's the natural follow-up.
I'm not, there's a lot of great people in the Democratic Party. I happen to be partial to a Hoosier who I knew very well when he was the mayor of South Bend. Pete Buttigieg is a good friend of mine. I think he's incredible.
You'd like to see him run for president?
I'd love to see Pete Buttigieg run for president, and if he did, I would support him because I know him. And quite frankly, I think he'd be excellent.
Building on that question from Debbie, how would you grade the Biden administration so far, their first 2 years in office?
B-.
Why is that?
He's done some things well. First off, I think we're better off with him in the White House than we were with the former president, all due respect. And also, I didn't like the exit from Afghanistan. It was ugly and messy, but it was necessary. Yes, I did. I was in the United States Navy. It was ugly, it was messy. It was necessary to get us out of there, so I give him credit for getting us out of there, but it was ugly, and it's an embarrassing moment in American history, for sure.
Okay, we have more questions here from some of our viewers. This is from Nathan Moody in Indianapolis, who asks, do you think if someone takes the oath as a public servant that they should sell all of their public holdings and or stocks before taking office?
Ouch. This one hurts. I love the stock market. It's one of my hobbies, actually.
Are you going to give it up if you're elected?
If it's a law that's passed. I mean, right now you're not under this obligation to do so.
What do you invest in most notably?
I trade money on my own behalf. Right now I'm trading on the market. I follow the market very closely. I understand it. So I have a couple stocks in oil and things like that, but for the most part, I time the swings of the market. I'm a finance major. I've been trading my own stocks for over 20 years. But if a law was passed that said that senators and congresspeople could not have stocks, could not trade on their own, I would get out of it.
You think such a law should be passed, but otherwise, you think if a law isn't passed, members of Congress will continue to trade. You would continue to trade.
I don't like the fact that members of the administration are trading, especially on inside knowledge, and there's laws against that. But quite frankly, right now, if there was a law passed, I would definitely comply with it. Would I support such a law? I probably would. And I would have no problem during the 6-year period or 12-year period I was in the U.S. Senate not trading stock, but I would miss it because I do enjoy the stock market. I love watching it every day. I love knowing what's going on. It's like my passion, but I would rather be a U.S. Senator than trade stock.
All right.
Probably save a couple bucks also. So.
More viewer questions here. Now from Matthew Abner in Evansville, who asks, would you support term limits on all federally elected and federally appointed positions throughout the United States government?
I get this question a lot, and quite frankly, I'm old-fashioned. I think that voters are term limits. And believe me, I've run up against a couple people that have been in office a long time, and it's very frustrating. But the Constitution doesn't have anything about term limits, just like it doesn't have anything about filibuster.
So generally, you're a no on that question. You think the voters themselves, the choice they make, those are the term limits, in your view. Mm-hmm. Another question here from Carolyn Hers in Indianapolis. She asks, what do you see as the major problems with our healthcare system, and what should Congress do to fix them?
I live in a city of Hammond's socioeconomically challenged, more so than other cities. And the residents of my city aren't worth as much to hospitals because they don't have private health care insurance. And I don't believe that there should be two healthcare systems in America, the healthcare system for the wealthy and the healthcare system for the poor, and that's what we have right now. So in cities like Hammond, the poorer cities in Indiana and across America, you see hospitals that are moving out of our city because they'd rather go to the wealthy areas to serve people with private health care insurance, and I don't believe in that America. And if we keep heading on this track for the next 20 years, you're going to see two different Americas. You're going to see places like Hammond with no hospitals, where if you have a heart attack, you're probably just going to die. And then you'll see the wealthier places that have multiple options. So,
what do you think the Affordable Care Act meant to our country? Was it a positive or a negative or a complex mix of both?
The affordable health care?
The Affordable Care Act.
Right. No,
Obamacare.
I think it's a step in the right direction. I think we have further to go, though, being honest. I think every American should be entitled to a certain level of health care. And quite frankly, if you have better than that offered from your job, God bless you, you know. But I think every American should be entitled to a certain level of health care that includes dental and vision, being honest with you. I think, you know, we're the best country in the world. I think we should treat our citizens with a level of, you know, guaranteed level of medical.
That bill wasn't popular in Indiana at the time.
Right, still not probably, but quite frankly, it's about doing the right thing. You know, I believe that federal government could do better. I mean, I believe our citizens deserve better.
Another topic that we've received several questions from viewers about is the topic of marijuana. You've made that a major part of your campaign platform. What would you do in Washington to fulfill that promise?
I don't know if it's major. I acknowledged at the time it's not the most important thing going on in America, but it's important if you're being arrested for going to a dispensary in Illinois and buying gummy bears, coming back home and you get arrested. It's important to you then.
Senator Young, in our interview just yesterday, said you had made this issue your top priority. Do you disagree with that assessment?
It's not my top priority. My top priority is women's reproductive rights, no doubt about it. My top priority is inflation, no doubt about it. But for the people that are arrested for marijuana charges and people that have been charged with a crime, it's important to them. And I don't think it's right that all of our surrounding states sell marijuana either recreationally or medicinally, and Hoosiers go to these places every single day. You go to any dispensary right now, 75% of the plates will be from our state. And every time we buy and drive back into the state of Indiana, you become a criminal. I don't agree with that. I think we could do better in Indiana. The state of Illinois made more money taxing cannabis last year than they did taxing alcohol.
You think it should be legalized federally, and to what extent would you work to try and achieve that in Congress? If
I would do everything I can to help achieve that in Congress because I think it's equitable. And quite frankly, I think Indiana would be the type of state that would do very well with our low tax environment and our agricultural economy. It would give us more options on things to plant in our state. It would give us opportunities in places like Hammond, Gary, Indianapolis on maybe possibly having grow houses, you know, new jobs, new economic development opportunities.
Any concerns about the potential negative impact of that? There are those who say it may not be the best thing from a healthcare perspective.
I don't think alcohol is the best thing either, Dan, I'll be honest with you. And, you know, but the fact is when we have alcohol, we have rules that say you can't drive on it, you can't sell it to minors, you don't get drunk before you go to work. Marijuana is no different than that. Believe me, I've tried both of them. And they're very similar in a lot of ways, but we've stigmatized one so much that, you know, we're sort of ignorant on the issue. I think that, quite frankly, that we should control cannabis in Indiana like we control alcohol, and I think it would be well regulated.
Fentanyl has been a big issue across the country. Senator Young and others in the GOP have pointed to that issue recently, calling for further security along our southern border. What should Congress do to deal with this fentanyl crisis that we've been seeing around the country?
We need a hardened border, and we need comprehensive immigration reform, and these are things that we sent Todd Young to Washington, D.C. in 2010 to accomplish, and here we are 12 years later, and all we get from Senator Young are, this is his top priority in his campaign commercials, but the fact is he's had multiple opportunities to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and he's failed. He's chosen other items instead, like tax cuts. But the fact is, I'm married to an immigrant. My wife, Marissa, immigrated to America, got her green card, did it legally, and I support legal immigration. And I believe in America being the melting pot. I do not support illegal immigration. I think we need to enforce our border laws and make our border strong. I believe in that.
Some of our viewers asked Senator Young as well about his votes to send military aid and support to Ukraine as they face this invasion from Russia. Where do you stand on that issue? Would you continue to support funding for the war effort? Are you at all concerned about accounting for the money that's already been sent to Ukraine?
You know, I support sending arms to Ukraine, absolutely. Being a Navy submariner for 6 years.
Arms and money.
Yeah, arms and money, absolutely. I think that Russia is our military enemy. They've been our military enemy since the Cold War began. When I was in the Navy, for the 6 years I was in, that's all we did was chase Russian subs, and Russian subs chase us. Russia is off the coast of America right now pointing nuclear weapons at our city, just like we're off the coast of Russia right now pointing nuclear weapons at their city. Todd Young wants to talk about China. Listen, China is our financial enemy. I think China wants to take us over financially. Russia wants to nuke bomb Ukraine. Russia is pointing nuclear weapons at America right now. Russia is our true enemy. And right now, Ukraine needs our help, and we can't let Russia just come over and take over a free country without resistance. And I think America is appropriate appropriately responding.
Let's also talk about January 6th here. Some political reporters noted that during the debate last week, your comments about Senator Young and January 6th were not entirely accurate. Here's what you had to say.
He told a group of protesters that he agreed with them, that Donald Trump won the election, but he took an oath under God, and then he walked into the U.S. Senate and voted for Joe Biden.
What an unfortunate presentation that just was. Listen, I acknowledge the day that the election became official, that Joe Biden was president of the United States.
In fact, he did acknowledge Biden's victory in December, and on January 6th, what he said to those protesters was, I share your conviction that President Trump should remain president, but the law matters. I took an oath under God. Do we still take that seriously? Essentially explaining why he was not agreeing with the protesters' wishes the results be overturned. Was he not actually disagreeing with those protesters in your view? Can you clarify what you meant there?
I think Todd Young is two-faced. He wants to have it both ways. He wants the people on the steps of the Capitol that wanted him to oppose President Biden's certification. He wants them to think one thing. And by the way, while he's wearing his camouflage coat, which is important because when military people wear their camouflage, it means you're going off to war. And Todd Young wore his camouflage jacket on January 6th, which is code to any military person going to war. And he tells them one thing on the steps of the U.S. Senate, and then he walks in and does a different thing in the Capitol. And that's two-faced. You can't have it both ways, Todd.
You don't think he was disagreeing with those protesters? You think he was trying to...
He's trying to make everybody happy. And sometimes you got to stand up and be a leader and say, listen, President Biden won the presidency. I'm going to go in there and do my constitutional duties. And just, if we would do stuff like that, you know, we may not have had that insurrection that day.
What do you want to see Congress doing moving forward with the January 6th probe?
If anybody broke the law, they should be punished under the criminal code. Absolutely.
You think the former president should comply with the subpoena the committees just issued there?
Absolutely. It's U.S. Congress issuing him a subpoena. Absolutely.
Do you think those investigations will continue? If Republicans take back Congress, you may see a whole different
if the Republicans take back Congress, January 6th will fall off the radar. There's no doubt. And that's unfortunate because January 6th was a black mark on American history. It's only the second time in our history as a nation that the Capitol's been attacked. And it was attacked at the instigation of the former president. It's very embarrassing.
Finally, as we wrap up, what else do you want voters to know before they go to the polls next month?
Accountability is important. And as the mayor of the city of Hammond, I know who my bosses are. It's the 6.6 million people that live in the state of Indiana. 81,000 people live in the city of Hammond. And I plan to be accountable and go around the state of Indiana and hold Senators' Night Out across this state in every district every year. And that's called accountability. And people could show up, and if they're angry with me, they could show up and ask questions, and I'll justify why I did what I did. But that's accountability. That's being respectful to your bosses, the Hoosier people.
2 weeks until Election Day. Mayor Tom McDermott, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
We really appreciate it. You can vote early right now, absentee or casting a ballot by mail. All 92 counties have different times, dates, and locations to vote early. You can check those times at indianavoters.in.gov. And you can find an early voting location open until Monday, November 7th. Of course, Election Day is November 8th. Polls open at 6 a.m. that day. When you cast a ballot this year, you may find different races on the ballot than you're used to. State lawmakers drew new lines for congressional districts. You can see the updated map for our congressional districts here, different state house districts as well. So you'll want to also check on that and check to make sure that your registration is up to date. Every Senate race this year is crucial, of course. The balance of power in the U.S. Senate now at a 50-50 split. And that's why we sat down here this week with Senator Todd Young and his opponent, Tom McDermott, to get your questions answered. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.